Good. There we go.
There we are. Good evening, everyone. This is Rob Orson with the Emerging Revolutionary War. I'm joined tonight with my good friend Phil Greenwalt, and we're very excited tonight to have Evan O'Brien, who's the creative manager at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum there in Boston. As we've been talking about leading up to this talk, we're really going to be focusing on a lot of the 250th events leading up to the Tea Party, and that's going to be a big thing going on this December. I think, Phil, you and I will be up there in December. We might harass Evan when we get up there. But Evan's been so gracious to come on with us tonight to kind of talk about a little bit about the history of the Boston Tea Party, kind of give an overview of the events that led up to it, talk about the Tea Party itself. And then I really want Evan to kind of focus a lot on what you all are doing up there. There's a lot of events. I'm hoping our viewers will really kind of go up there and see some of the great work you all are doing, especially coming up in December. But Evan, if we get started, just kind of give us a little bit of background. I think everyone knows about tossing the tea in the harbor, and then they went home and the war started. But that's not exactly what happened. So if you can give us a little bit of background.
Thank you. Yeah, that's not exactly what happened. And, thank you for the opportunity today, guys, to talk about this important event in American history. The Boston Tea Party, or also known as the destruction of the tea, or the incident on Griffin's Wharf, was one of the first significant acts of defiance by the American colonists toward the British Crown, leading up to the American Revolution. At the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum, of course, we look at the Boston Tea Party as the single most important event leading up to the American Revolution. I suppose that could be debated. A few places like Lexington and Concord might have their say in that conversation, but we look at the Boston Tea Party as kind of the catalyst that began the fall of the dominoes that ultimately led to the American Revolution. In a real nutshell, or a tea chest, I suppose, the Boston Tea Party was an event that involved about 100 and 150 men. Some were disguised, some were not. Matter of fact, a lot of them weren't, who boarded 3 vessels at Griffin's Wharf on December 16th, 1773. These men were divided up into about 3 different boarding parties of about 30 to 50 per vessel, and during 3 to 3.5 hours destroyed 340 chests of East India Company tea. That's the story that we know. But what really led to the Boston Tea Party was a whole series of events that would culminate in the tea's destruction. The American colonists were actually quite frustrated about an East India Company monopoly on the sale of tea. This tax on tea was originally levied against the colonies with the passage of the Townshend Acts in 1767. That would tax home goods like glass, lead, pewter, paint, and most importantly, tea. The repeal of the Townshend Acts would actually happen on the day of the Boston Massacre, but Parliament did keep one tax in place to keep up the right, as they would say, and that would be the tax upon tea. And while there was that 3 pence per pound of tax on tea, it was actually rather paltry. It wasn't very expensive. But ultimately, what the Tea Act of 1773 did was it handed the East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea. And this is probably the most important aspect of the Boston Tea Party, and the thing to walk away from tonight is that this event was mainly about a lack of representation in Parliament, and this fear that if the British Parliament could hand the East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea, well, what could they do to other businesses, other trades in the American colonies? So to take matters in their own hands, once these vessels began to arrive in Boston Harbor, beginning with the ship Dartmouth, which arrived on November 28, 1773, a whole series of town meetings and meetings of the body of the people sprang up at Faneuil Hall and the Old South Meeting House. And it was there, after a series of about 2 weeks of meetings, that the decision was made that something had to be done with the tea. And of course, all 340 chests would steep a salty brew in the icy waters of Boston Harbor in the evening of December 16th, 1773.
You like crossed out like 3 of my questions I had for you. You did a good job there.
Well, we can get deeper in there if you want. Again, very surface level.
So you definitely, I like the way you talked about how, a lot of people read about the Tea Party and think that, it's all about the tea, but you made a great point. It's about the taxation, right? It's about, Massachusetts I'm from Virginia, so I can't say too much because we're very much like people in Massachusetts. We think we're the best and the smartest, but they had a lot of pride in their independence, so to speak, and how their colonial government was set up. And I think this right of taxation and you really kind of hit them in the wrong spot, right?
Right.
And when you start looking into this too, there's a lot of people in Boston, including John Hancock, that are making a lot of money, in the shipping business. Some of it's not totally legal, but when you start hitting Boston in the wallet there, I think you get some people really upset. But it's about the taxation. That's necessarily about the tea, but that's what everyone thinks it's just about the tea, but it's really about that taxation and establishing that foundation, right? For, like you said, Townsend Acts were repealed, but they left that one on there just to kind of make that point.
Exactly. And that was frustrating, and there was
Right.
an overwhelming concern, about where this money was going. So the income from the tea tax was actually not going back into the local Boston community. It was going to pay the salaries of British or royally appointed people, specifically, the royal governor, that sort of thing, but also the consignees. So the tea tax was not really a tax that was paid by the individual consumer initially. When the tea was supposed to arrive in Boston, it would be taken by wholesalers, also known as consignees. Those consignees were Richard Clark, Jonathan Clark, and Isaac Clark, Joshua Winslow, Benjamin Faneuil Jr., and two of Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson's sons, Thomas Hutchinson Jr. and Elijah Hutchinson. So you also sprinkle in some nepotism and the idea that these people who were royally appointed, who were not duly elected by the populace of Boston, was having a say in this tea tax. And so ideally, had the tea been landed and been brought into stores around colonial Boston, that tea tax would actually be first paid up front by the consignees, and then that tax would have been worked into the sale of the tea and the individual consumers. So there's all this complexity to what is often seen as a very simple event, right? A bunch of people, several hundred guys go down to Griffin's Wharf, they go onto these ships, they smash the tea chests open, they throw it overboard, and they have a big party. Actually, it was, not really like that at all. Yes, several hundred people went down onto the wharfs and destroyed this tea, but it was a well-orchestrated event. It was planned. And it was planned because there were 2 weeks of meetings and 2 weeks, to really figure out what they were going to do with this tea. And they would petition the royal governor multiple times to send it back to England. They would send Francis Roach, the owner of the ship Dartmouth, that first one to arrive, to go before Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson multiple times, pleading with him to send the tea back to England and not land it here in Boston. And it was only at the 11th hour, at the expiration of this deadline, that they finally took matters into their own hands to go down to Griffin's Wharf to destroy the tea.
I feel bad for Francis Roach a little bit when you read this story. He's kind of stuck in the middle, right? He can't really return the tea. He can't, the consignee, there's this, can't land it, can't return it. He goes to one of the meetings there, and they ask him to just take it back, and it's like, well, it's not that easy. I can't actually do that. Talk a little bit about, if you could, about that whole, it's very complicated, right? I mean, it's very legal. It's very lot of legalese there, but it's interesting about when that ship arrives, right? And then the timeline they have to do either send it back, take it on, or it's going to be confiscated. So, and he's a businessman, right? I mean, I think he's probably sympathetic a little bit to everything, but obviously at the end of the day, he has to make money. So talk a little bit about that kind of complexity there of why that tea can't be landed, why it can't be returned.
Right. Yeah, it is very complex. And I do see Francis Roach as a sympathetic character. I don't really believe he was, on the patriot leaning side of things, right. But nevertheless, he tried to do the right thing, and he was completely stuck in the middle. And he was, having this deadline breathing down his neck that dates all the way back to 1651 with the passage of the Navigation Acts. So what the Navigation Acts did is it declared that American colonies could only export certain commodities directly to England. It also effectively prevented American colonies from trading with any other European nations. All vessels clearing in or out of Boston Harbor were also required to be built in Great Britain or her colonies and owned by British subjects. But most importantly for the Boston Tea Party, it stated that a vessel entering the harbor had 20 days to unload that cargo and pay the duties assigned to that cargo. And so when the Dartmouth arrived on November 28, 1773, the timeline for the Dartmouth becomes the literal timeline for the Boston Tea Party. From the moment that that vessel entered the harbor, that clock began ticking, and we had 20 days leading up to December 17th to decide the fate of what they called the pernicious weed. So Francis Roche was summoned before the meetings of the body of the people, both at Faneuil Hall and Old South Meeting House. And initially, the moderator asked, is it your intention to land the tea? And he would immediately reply, he would rather have no business with it, but he was compelled to do so. You have to keep in mind, today, we can send something back via, online shipping. It's really not that hard for us. But this cargo was his lifeblood. That was his financial structure, his financial support, his family's financial support. It just took 6 to 8 weeks to cross the North Atlantic at great risk. It's sitting here in Boston. He needs that cargo to be offloaded for his own financial security. The consignees need that tea to be offloaded for their own financial security, but also their own governmental security. They can't show the general populace that they're weak and unable to handle, the shipment of cargo. And so one of the things that's always struck me about the Boston Tea Party, it really wasn't a party in a fun way. It was one of the most stressful times in Boston's history, leading up to the American Revolution. Everyone had a say. Everyone had an opinion as to what to do with this tea. And there's an anecdote that when Francis Roche returned to the final meeting of the body of the people to Old South Meeting House on December 16, 1773, and when finally asked, what did the governor say? Will the governor allow the vessels to be sent back to England? He said no, that the governor has refused all these requests and the tea must be unloaded as the law demands. And merchant John Andrews, who was living a few blocks away from Old South Meeting House, said that at that exact moment, when Francis Roche delivered the final word from the royal governor, the 5,000 people inside Old South Meeting House were so loud, the building shook with such fervor and emotion, he would write in his diary that it sounded like the creatures from the infernal regions had broken loose. And so you can imagine all of this tension and all of this ire, the entire population of Boston hating on this one man, Francis Roche, who was simply trying to do the best he could for his family, the best he could for his business, and the best he could for his community. And I think depending on what side you're looking at, you can say that for the Tory and the Loyalist side, you can say that for the Patriot side, and you can even say that for those moderates who are kind of stuck in between.
Yeah, and I think most are in between, right? I mean, we always talk about one side or the other. And I think Phil, you have a question, but real quick, you mentioned Old South Meeting House. I've been there many times. To think of 5,000 people in that space is pretty amazing.
It really is. It
It
doesn't seem that
crazy.
big, but
It
was.
It's crazy, and it wasn't heated well, and it's just I just can imagine the atmosphere of 18th century 5,000 people in one space like that. It's fascinating.
Right.
I think what is it? OSHA today would have a problem with putting 5,000 people.
Yeah, fire marshal as well.
Fire marshals would. So just a general question that struck me, and so I figured that's a little bit in the weeds. We do know what some of the major players are. What happens to the Roach after this? Do we know? Is he sail off into history? No pun intended. Does it wreck his business? Just dawned on me. You really don't hear about what happens with some of the ship owners, like you do some of the other major players on December 16th.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually great. I mean, Francis continues his business. And at the end of the meeting of the body of the people, it is actually there's a movement made to stand up and actually thank Francis Roche for his attempt to get the governor to send his tea back to England. And also, I believe it's Dr. Thomas Young who stands up and reminds the crowd that he did everything that was asked and no harm should come to him or his family. And I know that Francis Roche was very concerned about that. In one of the first meetings, he actually requested that of the body of the people. If I do this, can you give me some assurances that both myself and my family will be protected and taken care of during this? So the Roche family business continued. They did lose a little bit. The Dartmouth did founder following the Boston Tea Party, as did the other vessel owned by the Roche family, the Beaver, a short time after that. It didn't sink, but it was damaged and then sold. So much like any merchant or anyone in the shipping business, ships come and ships go, but their business did continue.
And then we do have a random question, or more of a debate going on.
There's a debate here about mud or water.
Mud, yeah, mud or water. It's going on in the comment section about when he dumped it. Was it tied out? Did it land in the water? Did it land in the mud? Did he push it into the mud, into the water? So you want to put this debate at rest, Evan?
Yeah, sure. This one's one of my favorites. So I will take the moderate stance and call it muddy water.
There you go.
I
love it.
Yeah, there was some water there, but not very much. In some areas where the harbor was, you're talking probably a couple of inches rather than a few feet, because the Boston Tea Party actually took place on an evening of what they referred to as low water, dead low tide, but it was also close to a king's low tide. They might, especially here in Boston, with rising water and all that stuff, we oftentimes get a warning of a king's high tide, and certain areas along the harbor walk here will actually flood. The water will come right up over and cause some damage here and there and flood some sidewalks. It was the exact opposite of that on December 16th, 1773. The vessels were in such low water, they were actually stuck in the mud in Boston Harbor, right off of Griffin's Wharf. And so when the Sons of Liberty threw the chests of tea overboard, they had to do a couple of things. So number one, these chests were very, very heavy. Some weighed as much as 300 to 400 pounds. So they were hoisted up using block and tackle, swung over to the rails or sides of the ships. Then they were broken open with axes and hatchets. And then the loose leaf tea was dumped out of the chest. And then the chest itself was thrown into the harbor for good measure. Now, all those loose leaf tea leaves actually piled up. There was so much tea, 92,000 pounds in weight approximately was destroyed during the Boston Tea Party. There was so much tea, there were mountains of tea that were piling up, sitting in the mud and the muck all the way up to the rails of the vessels. So the 100 to 150 individuals made a decision: send the young apprentices over the side to smash the loose leaf tea back down into the mud and into the muck. And so I would say that there was some water there, but most of it was mud.
That's fantastic information. That's great. I'm always fascinated by the governor, Hutchinson. I know he's criticized a lot. I was just reading today before we signed on about, he wanted his council to kind of authorize military, the British Navy or military to step in, but they wouldn't do it. So he felt he kind of took the I don't know what the right word is here, but they said, well, it's out of my hands. I can't sign off on this to return. I don't have that authority. I can't order the British Navy in to protect your cargo, or the men that come over from Castle William to protect your cargo. So you're kind of on your own. Do you think he did that because his family was involved? Do you think he did because he thought that was the best political decision for him to make, to kind of put the onus back on, the Sons of Liberty, those who were leading this whole effort?
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit of both, but I think he too tried to do, at least in his mind, the right thing. He received the petitions from Francis Roche. He met with him multiple times. He listened, but he was also in an impossible situation. If he allowed the tea to be sent back to England, he would look weak with his authority, and he needed to make sure that that authority was solid. However, if he sent in the troops, well, he would probably have another Boston Massacre on his hands. And that was also really important. So if you see anything on TV or any movies or anything like that about British soldiers coming down and attempting to stop the Boston Tea Party, or, even, God forbid, Royal Governor Hutchinson himself on the ships telling the Sons of Liberty to stop throwing the tea, none of that is accurate. there were no British soldiers on Griffin's Wharf that day. Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson was hiding in Milton. And
right.
so all of the soldiers were actually over at Castle William, today known as Castle Island, and they were stationed there following the Boston Massacre. And so there was this very real fear that if the British were to come in and try to stop the proceedings at Griffin's Wharf, they would have another massacre on their hands. However, there was still a threat. There were 3 British men of war vessels, the Active, the Captain, and the Kingfisher, that were just a stone's throw away from Griffin's Wharf. And they saw the entire proceedings that night. And there's even a journal entry from Admiral Montague where he claims he could have stopped it at a moment's notice. However, they too did not want that blood on their hands. Right. And so they made the conscious decision to not intervene at the incident on Griffin's Wharf and allow the proceedings to continue. And I think Governor Hutchinson, despite a lot of what he did wrong, also deserves a bit of credit for attempting to not allow things to get out of hand.
So let's take a moment here and let's play the great game of what if, because I know we all love working in the public history field or working in museum. We all love when people come up and go, well, what if this happened? So for now, I get to ask the question for once.
It never happens, Phil. It never happens.
What if Stonewall Jackson would have lived? What if George Washington would have crossed the Delta? So just 2 from my experience. But what if the British would have responded that night? What do you think? Would that have been another Boston Massacre type thing, or would that have been enough to quell the crowd? If you had to take a guess, I know it's based on very loose historical foundation here, but just a what if for a few minutes.
So it's tough to say. My personal opinion is that this event was so emotional and there was such a buildup to it. You know, this wasn't some sort of off the cuff, just spur of the moment thing. There were thousands of people, again, 5,000 inside Old South Meeting House. The population of Boston at the time was a little over 16,000 people. And so for 5,000 of those people to be so impassioned and so moved by what was leading up to December 16th, I personally think that there was too much emotion involved for things to go smoothly were the British soldiers to intervene. Do I think it would be a horrible, bloody massacre? I hope not. But it's impossible for me to believe that nothing would have happened, just given the pure emotion of the buildup to that night.
Exactly. I mean, you see so many other times where it's like powder alarm or what happens at Salem and so forth, where like there's close, but there's not that charged atmosphere already to begin with. And
right.
And that's, I think, would have made it truly amazing that no violence does happen. So, I mean, to the extent that it could have possibly, which is, I think, remarkable that night.
Yeah, I agree.
One thing I was going to bring up as we start getting in from the legalities of what's going on into that actual night on the 16th. I always find it fascinating that inside the meeting house there, you have Sam Adams, right? You have some of the big leaders, but when it comes to what's going on the wharf later, they're detached from that. And I've always thought that that's a very wise political move on their part. Do you believe that's totally intentional?
I do. So I think for a multitude of reasons. Number one, Samuel Adams was too important to the cause to potentially be arrested down there. So you imagine this was an act of treason. And so anyone who participated in the Boston Tea Party very easily could have been arrested. And they didn't know at the time that the Redcoats were not going to intervene. So they were taking a sizable risk going down there. Now, they were disguised to some degree. We can talk about that as well. But that disguise kind of concealed their true identities to some degree. But there was still a great risk going down there. And so one of the things that I love most about the Boston Tea Party is, you're right, it wasn't Samuel Adams on board. It wasn't John Hancock. It wasn't John Adams. It was what I often call an ordinary citizen doing an extraordinary thing. These were a mix of Boston's population. And it's important to know that it wasn't just Bostonians who took part in the Boston Tea Party. Because of the 2-week deadline, news got to all the surrounding towns and villages and communities around Boston. And people came to Boston town to find out what was happening, to participate. There were young tradesmen and apprentices who were working in their shops. And when they heard, people going down to Griffin's Wharf, they would ask their masters, "Can I go too?" And permission was granted. And so there were people that had planned to go down to Griffin's Wharf to participate in this event. And there were a large amount of people that just got caught up in the emotion of it and swept up and suddenly found themselves knee deep in tea, destroying it and throwing it over the sides of the ships. And so I love the fact that, the Boston Tea Party participants could have been a merchant, a wallpaperer, a barrel maker, a housewright, a shipwright, a rigger, a rope walker. All of these quote unquote ordinary people did this extraordinary thing, and they're more than worthy of our recognition and remembrance for that. And so, when I learned about the American Revolution in history class, all I ever heard about was Sam Adams and John Adams and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all these famous names. I never really put two and two together until I began to delve more into the Boston Tea Party, that it wasn't those people that took part in the single most important event leading up to the American Revolution. It was someone as common as myself who just felt moved to volunteer, to participate, to be engaged in their community, to risk everything to ultimately commit treason in the eyes of the British authority.
Yeah, that's very much involved in their community, right?
Exactly. It's hard to get more involved than risking everything for it.
Right. That's a great volunteer program. So I think, as you said, Hancock, Adams, Warren, and others are not there at the wharf. So as the meeting ends and they've gotten the response from the governor, how does that transition into, dozens of people storming, down to Griffin's Wharf? Like, do you think there was a signal? Was someone sent out to were these people gathering someplace else outside the meeting? Were they? So how did that happen?
A combination of everything that you just said, actually. Okay. So there was a prearranged plan, we believe. So again, given the deadline, and after all of these town meetings, minutes were taken. And it's curious, at the very beginning of the tea crisis, a lot of the minutes will simply say, nothing transacted, matter of record. Well, darn well that something was transacted. They're in their meeting about deciding, whether or not to destroy all of these chests of tea. And yet there is this shroud of secrecy around some of this planning. There's a shroud of secrecy around who might be involved. We know that Samuel Adams was kind of gathering his troops, so to speak, and working out various permutations of what will happen. So if the governor sees reason and sends the ships back to England, then X will happen. If we get to this date and there's still no decision, then we will assign, guards on Griffin's Wharf to watch over the vessels, to prevent anyone from sneaking on board and taking the tea under the cover of darkness and landing it without our say. So there's that plan. Then there's the plan for if the deadline expires and they have no choice. And if we go back to the final meeting at Old South Meeting House, that meeting of the body of the people, after Francis Roche gives the final news that the governor will not send the vessels back to England with the tea on board, Samuel Adams stands up and says, there is nothing more a meeting can do to save this country. This, we believe, was some sort of prearranged signal. We believe this because almost instantaneously after saying that sentence, multiple men stand up inside Faneuil Hall. There's a war whoop supposedly heard from the back, and people appear already disguised inside Old South Meeting House and immediately outside. So if you're telling me that these guys suddenly said, well, hey, I'm going to grab this and put this on my head and put a sock on my head and all of a sudden grab lampblack and soot spontaneously, that doesn't make sense to me. What makes much more sense is that some people had a prearranged plan, that they had meetings leading up to it, and that they knew that if the governor was going to send the ships back to England, or not going to send the ships back to England, they had to enact that plan. We also know that a woman named Sarah Bradley Fulton, a sister of several of the Boston Tea Party participants, also known as the mother of the Boston Tea Party, it is believed was involved in gathering some disguises for the men, especially her brothers. So there's definitely some sort of planning in place leading up to December 16th. But like I also said, there were a great number of people who just got caught up in the spontaneity of their aspect of the event. So what I personally believe is that the gentlemen, the men who were part of the prearranged plan, once they began to leave Old South Meeting House and head down to Griffin's Wharf, that word spread. And as word spread, more and more people came out of their shops and out of their homes, either to go down to Griffin's Wharf and watch the proceedings or to jump on board the vessels and take part.
So I have to ask you, what were they wearing, right? That's always one of the discussion points.
There's the $1 million question right there.
Right.
Were they
Right.
dressed as Mohawk? So I'm sure it's a mix of everything, but so, you know, how do you all interpret this there in Boston at the museum?
Yeah, so it is absolutely true that the Sons of Liberty were disguised to some degree. Now, exactly what those disguises looked like is up for some debate, and it is impossible to say with any certainty exactly what they wore. And that's because some of these disguises, the majority of the disguises, were makeshift ones. And there were also many people who were not disguised at all. Specifically, someone like Robert Sessions, who we just placed a commemorative marker at his grave today in Hamden, Massachusetts, would go on to say that people like him, the young apprentices who just got caught up, didn't have time to gather a disguise, and yet still would go on board and participate in the tea's destruction. So ultimately, what do we think they wore? Well, what I can tell you with a great deal of certainty is that the majority of them would darken their faces with soot and coal dust. This was largely to obscure, their facial features. Was it some sort of traditional war paint that you might see in some artistic engravings or artwork? I doubt it. There might have been some ceremonial painting here or there, but I believe largely it was to obscure the facial features. We also know that the vast majority of those disguised wore heavy cloaks or blankets, not just to keep warm, because again, it was a freezing cold December night. We had just had 24 hours of rainy weather, but also to disguise their silhouette. So we, in modern sense, might have a huge wardrobe at home, right? I might have 5 or 6 different winter coats alone, depending on my mood or what I'm going to be doing. The vast majority of the Tea Party participants likely only had 1 or maybe 2 coats in their lifetime. And so you would often be recognized on the streets of Boston by your coat and what you wore and part of your status. And so if you're trying to go down to Griffin's Wharf and take part in the secretive event, you're not going to wear the same thing you'd wear at a town meeting and be recognized instantaneously. But you also need to keep warm, in that practical sense. So how do you disguise all of that? Where you wear a heavy blanket, a heavy cloak to disguise that silhouette and hide a feature that might be instantaneously recognizable by your friends. Now, most of the artwork that you see, if you were to go on Google right now and type in Boston Tea Party, you'll find probably 100 images ranging from ones that are sort of accurate to wildly inaccurate and borderline offensive. Honestly, the vast majority of those images are completely wrong. What you'll see is Native American or indigenous headdresses, much more closely aligned with the time of westward expansion, which is when America began to kind of rekindle this conversation of its own founding, this idea of Americana and patriotism, all the way, up into the bicentennial. We looked back at this iconic moment in American history with reverence, and we wanted to kind of capture that drama. And so the artists would look at images that they were familiar with. And at that time period, you would see much more Plains Native American headdresses. Nothing of the sort would have been worn on December 16th, 1773, largely because those participants would never have seen headdresses of that style. That is not what the indigenous tribes local to Massachusetts or even New York were likely wearing at the time. So all of that imagery that we think of when we see the Boston Tea Party comes from the 1800s and the 1900s, not from the 1700s. There's also no Boston Tea Party participant first-person account that ever mentions the word feathers. And so we don't truly know if feathers were worn by the participants. However, there is a fairly good chance that some feathers were involved, largely because the symbol of this Native American had been appropriated by the Sons of Liberty multiple times leading up to the Boston Tea Party. This Native American figure, oftentimes depicted as a woman, came to represent America in what they saw a truest form, let's say. And so during things like the Stamp Act riots, the Stamp Act protests, other protests based around British taxation, there were these moments where these disguised men would appear with some feathers in their hair, hooded, cloaked, facial features darkened, and they were seen as this fearsome intimidation, this borderline wild man who would come to talk about or to act out what this initial idea, this kernel of idea of American liberty, American independence. And it's ironic that the very same people that looked at the Native American tribes at the time as savages would also adopt this image to represent their own initial ideas of independence. But it's also important to know that in 1773, the Boston Tea Party was not an event necessarily tied to American independence. That would come later with things like the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts. But the Sons of Liberty, the participants of the Boston Tea Party, would utilize this Native American imagery in the Boston Tea Party protest as this initial idea of what it meant to be American and separate from British authority. And so I wish there was a much more simplistic and concrete answer that I can give. But what I can tell you honestly is that yes, they were disguised. No, we don't fully know what the disguises were. And no, not all of them wore a disguise that night in 1773.
That's a great answer.
Thanks.
There was rumor, this was, I think Rob started this, that one of them was actually wearing a Tom Brady rookie jersey that night. Since,
I heard that too, as a matter of fact.
Don't pick on Tom there, Phil.
Great fantasy football pickup, right?
That's right.
For years and years.
He was.
Little sore subject around here still.
They might be throwing his jersey into the harbor. But now, talking about, so you talked about placing a headstone at one of the guys' graves sessions today. We do know that we don't know the whole roster of people who are there. A lot of them went to the grave with it. But out of the ones we do know, is there a person that has flown under the radar that, since you've worked at the museum, that is that should be more known, well known, or has an interesting story that the public should be aware of?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a ton. Paul Revere, we do believe was on board the vessels. Obviously, we know his story. We don't have to belabor that point, but he's probably the most well-known individual who was on Griffin's Wharf that night on the vessels destroying tea. There are, other names that people interested in Boston's history, colonial history, might recognize. For instance, Thomas Crafts. Who would eventually go on to read the Declaration of Independence from the balcony of the old State House, a well-known, last name in colonial Boston. There were other people that might have been involved, like John Rowe, a merchant who was actually owner of the vessel Eleanor. We don't truly know if he was on board the vessels destroying tea that night, but there is a rather conspicuous entry into his journal that evening that he was home feeling unwell and had nothing to do with that night. And leading up to December 16th, he was writing copious paragraphs about his feelings about the Boston Tea Party or the tea being shipped to Boston. And so some people believe that he might have been on board the vessels destroying tea that night. There was Francis Akeley, who was the only person to be arrested for his involvement in the Boston Tea Party because he was overheard talking about it at the nearby tavern, promptly arrested, but then promptly also released due to lack of evidence. No one would corroborate his involvement. There was Robert Sessions, again, who we saw today, who was a farmer eventually, but also an apprentice here in Boston, would move to Western Massachusetts and would become a linchpin of his community, elected moderator of his town meetings, and elected to pretty much every office his community would hold. And I think, without singling more names out, I think that is what is always so refreshing to me and so inspiring to me. That these people, some were as young as 16 years old that took part in the destruction of the tea. And they would then go on to, the majority of them fought in the American Revolution, but even those that didn't would then go on to become founding members of new communities, not just in Massachusetts, not just in New England, but around the expanding nation. We've already traveled to Ohio and Michigan. We'll even be traveling to Paris, France later this year to honor a Boston Tea Party participant buried there. And these people, they were kind of forged in the crucibles of revolution, right? And so they went and they founded their town charters. They led their town governments. They became active in their communities. And it's on the shoulders of these Boston Tea Party participants that our nation was built. And so, while there are certain names that I would single out, I would also say collectively, they all deserve singling out. They all deserve recognition because they all took a great risk and a great sacrifice. And it's because of that and their involvement in their communities following this event that we have the nation that we have today.
Yeah, the fact that you guys are doing that work. I mean, if you need someone to go to Paris, let me know.
I was about to say the same thing there, Rob.
My job,
Paris.
my job doesn't send me to France, unfortunately. You kind of talked about this already a little bit about when someone asked about the water and the mud, but I just kind of want to wrap up the story itself before we start talking about some of the great work you guys are doing up there. So when they get down to Griffin's Wharf, which is not where the museum is. You can talk about that later. It's some other place. It's somewhat marked today, but today, and I know the answer to this, but I kind of want you to kind of expand on it. What did they do? They just dump the tea, or there's other things on these ships too, right? So from everything you read, they're very respectful of the items on the ships that are not the tea. So if you can kind of go into that a little bit about they're down there, how they get on the ships, how they get into the ships. We've already talked about the mud and the water, so you don't have to do that. But talk about the process of getting on these ships and getting into them and dumping the tea into the harbor.
Yeah, I actually think that's probably one of the most important points about the Boston Tea Party story to really hit home. The Boston Tea Party is often regarded as America's first peaceful protest. I suppose, the definition of the word peaceful is difficult. Sure, no one was beaten up that we know of that night, and it was less violent than, let's say, some of the Stamp Act riots. Certainly the governor's mansion and Counting House and all the stuff wasn't torn down brick by brick on December 16th, 1773. But of course, you can argue whether the lead up to the Boston Tea Party could be considered peaceful or not. But what we cannot argue is that the Sons of Liberty took great care to not damage the other cargoes on board the ships. This also goes back to the Navigation Acts and also goes back to the watch that the Sons of Liberty put on these vessels. So they were concerned that the consignees might send people under the cover of darkness to remove the tea and land it. And so to prevent that, they put a guard on Griffin's Wharf, keeping watch on the cargo of tea. However, during that 2-week lead up, of all the other cargoes just about were removed from the Dartmouth and the Eleanor. The Beaver was a bit different. The Beaver had a suspected case of smallpox on board. So she was held at Rainsford Island, also known as Quarantine Island in Boston Harbor. And she actually did not tie up to Griffin's Wharf until the day before the Boston Tea Party on December 15th. So her hold was filled with cargo in addition to the chests of tea. So when the Sons of Liberty went on board, they actually asked permission to go on board the vessels from the crews and the captains. That permission was given.
Sure. Hey, go ahead.
Exactly. Now, I don't think the captains and crews were really going to fight back. They have a mob of about 100 to 150 guys who are very intent on destroying the tea. As a matter of fact, one of them actually told one of the captains, "It's the tea we want and the tea we shall have." But there was an understanding and an agreement that no other harm would come to the crew or the cargoes on board. And they swore that solemn oath, and they held true to that oath. As a matter of fact, the only thing that was broken on board those vessels, aside from the chests of tea, was a padlock, which the Sons of Liberty broke and then returned the next morning a fresh new lock with a note of apology. It's also important to know, like you said, that there were various other cargoes on board: correspondence, mail, furniture, clothing. But what's also really interesting, on board the vessel Dartmouth, owned by Francis Roche, was the first shipment, the first edition book of poetry by Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved poet, the first enslaved poet in American history and only third woman in American history to publish a book of poetry. And her books had been sent from London, England, to Boston. They were taken off the Dartmouth prior to the destruction of the tea, safe and sound, and were sold at booksellers Cox and Berry just up the road on King Street. And so, yeah, there were many other different types of cargoes on board the vessel. And to your point as well, yeah, our museum is not right at Griffin's Wharf. It's about 100 yards away from where Griffin's Wharf once stood.
That's amazing about Phyllis Wheat. I did not know that. That's a great story that on that ship. Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Before we segue out of the tea and to the museum, I got asked this question. It came in from someone listening in and said that, is it proven that some of the original tea does exist? Many claims have been discounted due to analysis. So somewhere in the collections at the Boston Tea Party Ship Museum, is there some original tea that you guys have hidden away through the centuries?
Well, it's not hidden. It's available to the public to be seen.
Right.
So we have 2 or 3 tea related things. So the first would be the Robinson tea chest, which is the only known surviving tea chest from the Boston Tea Party and confirmed from the Boston Tea Party. And I can get into that as well, but ultimately the short version is it's been tested. It's been submerged in Boston Harbor salt water, traces of tea embedded in the wood from its really intense packing, and all that. So that's probably our piece de la resistance here at the museum.
Mhm.
We also have a vial believed to be a Boston Tea Party tea on loan to us from the Old North Church. This one's a bit different from the majority of the other vials of tea that you might find around New England. This one has a combination of the tea leaves and some liquid inside. We don't have a tremendous amount of provenance and story behind that. However, what we were informed is that it was poured out of the boot of a participant when he returned home. Combination of the loose leaf tea and the remnants of the water and the rain from that night. However, to be honest, our vial of tea has never been tested. We have not broken the seal. And so we do say that it's believed to be from the Boston Tea Party.
Mhm.
We do know that there are other vials of tea all around Massachusetts, especially, and various other museums have them. What you will really want to look for is that they are a type of either green tea or black tea and in loose leaf form. So one of the biggest myths about the Boston Tea Party was that the tea involved was in brick form. And you will even see sample tea bricks at rather reputable historic sites all around the nation that say this very same type of tea was involved in the Boston Tea Party. Unfortunately, that is not true. All of the tea involved in the Boston Tea Party was in loose leaf form. No brick tea was sold, especially in New England at the time, but the American colonists really had no taste for brick tea, and that was shipped to other parts of the globe. What was sent to America, especially in the lead up to the Boston Tea Party, was all loose leaf tea. 3 black teas, 2 green teas. And so those black teas especially, you can really kind of tell the difference between black teas and green tea leaves and when they were picked in the spring or later on in the year. And so I recommend visiting places like Massachusetts Historical Society, the Old State House, Old South Meeting House, Scottish Rite Museum. All of these great institutions have what is believed to be vials of Boston Tea Party tea, but to my knowledge, they've never been broken open and actually forensically tested.
Wow. And there's a lot of discussion going on, lots of questions coming in. So that means people are really enjoying this talk. So someone even has a possible ancestor that was there. I'll send you that person's email address in an email later. So
do, yeah.
maybe somebody you guys don't know about. I don't know. We'll see. As far as tea goes, I have to ask, Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts tea?
Neither.
Oh,
Wow, I thought you were gonna say Dunkin', right? Come on.
Right. Well, here at the museum, we do serve the 5 different types of teas to
Right.
story during the Boston Tea Party. So, when I drink tea, it's usually that. My favorite would actually be Souchong, which is a very smoky black tea. So, there was Buhi and Konju and Souchong were the 3 black teas, and Singlo and Hyson were the 2 green teas. Now, all the tea was all from the same plant, even the black teas and green teas, all from the same plant. It just depends on what time of year the leaves were picked. Green tea was picked very early on in the spring before the leaves had a chance to oxidize. The black tea were more oxidized leaves, picked later on in the year. The reason I like Souchong is it's smoked. And so that was part of the preservative nature and how they transported the tea. And I'm told if you're a fan of Scotch or whiskey like I am, Souchong is the one to go to. It's kind of like a liquid campfire. It's really, really nice.
I wrote that down. This is one of the few talks we've done, Phil, that I'm taking more notes for myself than
Hey, this is great.
learning a lot. So how much about tea did you know before you worked at the museum? Is this all learned when you got there? I'm pretty sure you probably had to learn all this, right?
So most of my tea experience has been absorbed with my time here at the museum over the 11 years I've been here. But I was a big fan of tea prior to coming here. I've always drunk it. I do tend to prefer coffee, but I do drink tea rather regularly. But yeah, a lot of that information has come during my time here at the museum.
It's a great segue in talking about the museum. Let's spend the next 10, 15 minutes before we sign off here to talk about the great museum you work at and some of the things you all do. So if you can kind of just talk about who you all are, what you do, what's a normal day if a visitor were to show up there, what do they get when they come through, and then talk about a little bit about what you all have planned, which is a lot. I know you'd be here for 3 hours doing that, but just some of the highlights, and we'll share the website to everyone as well in the chat. But if you can go ahead, just talk about the museum you work at.
Thanks. Yeah. So the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum is really unique. We are part of a landscape of, many, many amazing institutions. And a lot of our partners, like the work at Revolutionary Spaces, Old South Meeting House, Old State House, our partners with Massachusetts Historical Society, they are these incredible foundational members of the museum and historical community here in Boston. Actual historic sites, real buildings where those meetings took place and all that. We are a little bit different. We are not a historic structure. We are in a historic location. Again, only about 100 to 150 yards away from where Griffin's Wharf once stood. We're in the very same body of water where the Tea Party took place. But, the office that I'm in right now was built in 2011. We are not a historic structure. But what we do is we try to tell the story of the Boston Tea Party through kind of a 3-tiered methodology. We use first-person historical interpretation and live theatrical performance. We then add in some high-tech interactive exhibits, and then round everything out with 18th century artifacts directly tied to the Boston Tea Party and the greater time period to fully immerse our guests in the story of the Boston Tea Party. And so it's all told in a first-person guided experience. And so when people come to our museum, when you buy a ticket, the first thing you do is you take part in an interactive town meeting, which is very similar to all of those meetings of the body of the people that I spoke about a few minutes ago. You take an active role in the decision to destroy the King's tea. You're even given your own colonial identity, assign the name of a participant of the Boston Tea Party, and you can see the story unfold through the eyes of your colonial character. You're met by a colonial host who's also portraying someone involved in the Boston Tea Party or directly related to somebody who was involved in the event. And so you will take part in this active town meeting. We want you to make noise, yell huzzah, boo, fi, hiss, pound on the pews, really play along. Obviously, the kids love that interactive nature, but so do adults. And what we have found is if we encourage our guests to play, to kind of cast off their museum inhibitions, let down their guard, and enjoy themselves, well, they retain the information so much more easily, and they take an active role in their own education. So once the town meeting is complete, you will storm down to Griffin's Wharf, and you will go on board one of our 2 vessels. Now, the original Boston Tea Party ships sadly no longer exist, but two of our vessels are faithful replicas and recreations of the original ships. Both the Brig Beaver and the vessel Eleanor have been remade from the keel up to really, recreate the vessels that were involved in the Boston Tea Party. We do not have the Dartmouth yet. Hopefully that will change somewhere down the line. The Brig Beaver is the same vessel that was involved in the bicentennial of the Boston Tea Party that sailed across the Atlantic to be here. However, she's been completely rebuilt and refit over the years. After you'd, of course, destroy the King's Tea in Boston Harbor, you will get to throw a chest of tea into Boston Harbor during your time with us. Then you go inside and learn about how this 18th century story is told utilizing 21st century technology. We've got holograms, talking portraits, just like in Harry Potter. You will see artifacts like the Robinson Tea Chest, the only known surviving chest from the Boston Tea Party. You'll learn about the Tea Party's aftermath, the passage of the coercive acts, the intolerable acts, and learn how the tea's destruction then led to the shot heard around the world, the battles of Lexington and Concord, which were fired only 16 months after the tea hit the water. And you really learn how this event was inexplicably tied to the formative years of our region and our nation. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what our museum experience is, but it's all again told through the eyes of the person who is your guide. And so if you come to our museum 3, 4, 5 times, you will likely have a new colonial guide each time. And our interpreters are educated on everything leading up to the Boston Tea Party, what took place during the event, and what its lasting legacy is today. And every single tour is a unique experience, both for our historical interpreters and for our customers. And it's what makes us really different, I think, in the museum landscape here in Boston.
No, it's great. I've been through it once, and now I know I have to go back many times to get all these different viewpoints. So I know you all are partnering with a lot of different organizations there in Boston for the 250th Tea Party. So kind of hit some of the highlights, some of the things you all have planned. If people want to come to Boston, either this summer, fall, obviously fall is great in Boston, or on the actual cold day in December, like Phil and I will be doing, what would you recommend people check out, and some of the things you think are probably ones that people really want to see?
Absolutely. So as you just said, we are gearing up for the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 2023. We're a little under 6 months away. I can't believe it. And so we have been working on an entire commemorative year. There's been some events, prior to today's conversation, and there will be events all leading up to December 16th. And I really want to stress that this commemorative year, sure, the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum is, intimately involved in a lot of these, but it is not just about our organization. This advisory committee and all these advisory organizations all working together. There's some 24 different organizations across 3 different sectors: hospitality, travel and tourism, the historical community. All of that are all working together to really put Boston on the map, New England on the map, and really celebrate this important chapter of our nation's history and do it right, both in an accessible way and an accurate way, and in a way that will really entertain and educate anyone who comes to Boston. So first and foremost, I encourage you, come to town, come to Boston. It doesn't matter when. Obviously, we want to see you in December, but there's going to be events all leading up to that great night. So kind of rapid fire, I'll fill you in with some of our programming and then some other additional programming that's coming up. So I know that there's at least one descendant of a Boston Tea Party participant watching here today. Thank you so much. We have just partnered with the New England Historical Genealogical Society and American Ancestors to create the Boston Tea Party Descendants Program, which is a new lineage society, encouraging descendants like yourself to join, to share information, to meet each other, and to help build an online portal of information all dedicated to the participants in the Boston Tea Party. And that was launched last March, and it will be a program of ours in perpetuity. And with membership, there's newsletters and special events. And of course, we want descendants to come to Boston on December 16th and be involved in the grand scale reenactment that we're going to be doing that night. So that's great. We are also going to be highlighting the story of Phyllis Wheatley, her connection to the Boston Tea Party, If you're in town on July 6th and 7th, we will be hosting a special theatrical performance called A Revolutionary Encounter in London, a play about Phyllis Wheatley's visit to London and her book of poetry, directed and written by Deborah Wise. That'll be 7 p.m. here at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. If you have visited our website, bostonteaparty250.org, or gone on any of our social media channels, you've seen that we've been traveling all around the nation, placing commemorative markers at the headstones of known Boston Tea Party participants. We have done just about every community except for 1 or 2 in Massachusetts. All the other remaining New England states have been accounted for. We've traveled to Michigan and Ohio, but we are about to go to New York. In a couple of weeks, we'll be driving from Boston all the way out to Buffalo and visiting about 11 different communities across that great state. And that's going to be a lot of fun. All those dates and all those events are at bostonteaparty250.org. We'll also be traveling to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania a little bit later on this year as well. If you happen to find yourself again in Paris, you can join us in the tail end of September. We'll also be traveling to London and partnering with the East India Company. Yes, they still exist. They are much smaller now, a little bit nicer too. And so they will be donating 250 pounds of tea for the grand scale reenactment, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes. Also, if you're in Boston around the 4th of July, Boston's Harbor Fest, its world famous 4th of July celebrations, are all going to be themed the Boston Tea Party this year in honor of the 250th anniversary. We will be participating in a grand opening ceremony on June 30th this year. There's going to be a large Boston Tea Party cake that'll be cut. We have a themed trolley in partnership with Old Town Trolley of Boston, traveling around the city, building awareness of the 250th anniversary. And if you're local to Massachusetts, that trolley might be visiting a community near you, because what we are hoping for is for all of you watching at home today, students, adults alike, anyone around the world that wants to, send us loose leaf tea. Mail it to the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. We will place it into the tea chest that we'll be using during the grand scale reenactment, and we will throw your tea into Boston Harbor at the same location where the Tea Party occurred 250 years ago. If you send it to us, you have my word that you will receive a certificate of participation proving that your tea was involved in the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. This is a great opportunity for school kids across the country and around the world to participate. If you're not able to come to Boston in December, this is still a way for you to be involved in this, really important reenactment and anniversary in our nation's history. So in addition to all of that, we will be traveling to various historic sites around New England, all leading up to December 16th. A lot of our partner organizations like Revolutionary Spaces are doing tremendous work. And I encourage you, when you come to Boston, visit the Old South Meeting House, visit the Old State House, go to Faneuil Hall, check out the Massachusetts Historical Society, and also go outside the confines of Boston. Go to places like the Shirley Eustace House, the Hutchinson Field in Milton, where Hutchinson's mansion was, where he was cowering, waiting for Francis Rhodes to arrive to have those meetings with him to determine the fate of the tea. All of these, and a lot of these buildings anyway, still exist. And they need your patronage, and they need to shine in their own right during this really important anniversary year. So I would encourage you to come to Boston. Definitely check out bostonteaparty250.org. We're going to continue to load up special events gearing up to December 16th. But I would be remiss not to talk about what will be happening that night. So that night, about a decade's worth of work will culminate in a grand scale reenactment of the Boston Tea Party in partnership with Revolutionary Spaces, our main partner for that night, and also Revolution 250, a consortium of several dozen different organizations all working together. Actually, I think it's more like 70 different organizations all working together to really highlight these 250th anniversaries coming up. But the Boston Tea Party is the big kickoff to all of the 250th anniversaries forthcoming. And so that night, December 16th, 2023, there will be presentations all across the city in partnership with the city of Boston. We will be doing a recreation of the beginning of the meetings of the body of the people at Faneuil Hall that evening, probably around 4 o'clock, 4:30, somewhere around there. Those proceedings will end just before Francis Roche is sent to meet with Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson, where we will then pass the torch to our colleagues at Revolutionary Spaces, who will do the recreation of the final meeting of the body of the people at Old South Meeting House. And both these events are going to be filled with drama and intrigue and passion, and really something to behold. Once the meeting inside Old South Meeting House is concluded, there will be a rolling rally, a parade of many thousands of people from Downtown Crossing and Old South Meeting House down to the waterfront, where in days preceding, we will have moved the vessel Eleanor adjacent or abeam to the brig Beaver. And for the first time ever, we will throw tea from both of our ships. Any of you who have come to previous reenactments know that we've only used the brig Beaver up until this year, but we'll be throwing tea from both of those vessels. We're expecting many thousands of people, hoping for many thousands of people to come to Massachusetts and come to Boston that night. We will be hoisting real wooden chests of tea, faithfully recreated to resemble those involved in the historic event. They will be broken open by axes. The loose leaf tea that you will send us, in addition to 250 pounds of tea donated by the East India Company, will go overboard. Don't worry, the tea itself is biodegradable, and all of the wooden chests and all of the other things that go in the harbor will be retrieved at the end of the evening. But this event is going to be something, the only term I can use is grand scale, something the likes of which we've not seen since the bicentennial, and something that Boston and New England and the nation can really be proud of. And my advice would be, come to Boston, learn what makes Boston special, visit all these historic sites, and take part in something that is a once in a lifetime opportunity.
I have no doubt you'll get people. You at least have 10 people that from me and Phil know that are coming. So you have us for sure, but I know there's a lot more people. We've already booked our hotel room, and you can already tell the hotel rooms are starting to fill up. I was gonna make a side joke there. If the East India Company had just donated the tea originally 250 years ago, we wouldn't even be here right now.
Exactly. Well, they're sending us expired tea, just like they did in 1773 too. So it's accurate.
I mean, I've been looking at your website for a while, just trying to plan out, because I have friends in Boston trying to plan what we're doing. But I just want to say, I know it's more than you, I know it's more than your museum, but you guys are setting the bar really high for everybody else that comes after you with this anniversary commemoration. So kudos to you guys. Kudos to everyone in Boston our local 250th committee here has 20 different organizations. It's a lot of work. 70, I can't even imagine. You guys are setting the bar probably a little too high for the rest of us, but that's fine. I like the challenge.
Oh, thank you so
much. Phil, you have anything else before we let Evan? He's had a long day marking graves, so I don't want to keep him too much longer. Anything else, Phil?
I mean, yes, but I think for this time I'll wait till December to meet in person. So
we got a lot more questions, and we'll maybe do another one down the road. But thank you, Evan, for joining us tonight. Again, this has been fascinating. Lots of discussion on our chat. For everyone watching, I did put the Tea Party Museum link on there and the Boston 250th link, so you can get all that information that Evan's been talking about. In 2 weeks, I'll be back on our next Revelry, July 9th, and we'll be talking to Jim Bish, who's an author who is here locally in Virginia. He has a new book about Parson Weems. So we're going to shift from Boston back to Virginia, but Jim has a new take on Parson Weems, who is a biographer of George Washington. A lot of the myths of George Washington come from the Parson Weems book. He has a new book about Parson Weems and a new take on some of those myths. So please join us in 2 more weeks, July 9th at 7 o'clock right here on the Emerging Revolutionary War. Evan, thanks again for everything, and I will send you that email of that descendant and get the information to you. And thank you everyone for watching, and we'll hope to see you in 2 weeks. And if not, see you in Boston in a few weeks.
Thank you so much, everyone.